Hey everybody! Welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening, aviation enthusiasts, and welcome to another edition of CAF Warbird Tube. Tonight, episode 198. Nathan Huegen from CAF headquarters is going to join us to talk about the aftermath of the Doolittle Raid, that aftermath that took place in China after the raid in April of 1942. Now, whether you're joining us for the very first time or you're a loyal Warbird Tube fan, we're very happy to have you with us tonight. If you enjoy what you see, don't forget to spread the word on your favorite social media platform. Now, Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. To find out more about the CAF, our events, our aircraft, and of course, the spring tours are coming up very, very soon, visit our website, commemorativeairforce.org. Now, as you're watching tonight and listening to Nathan, you may have some questions. Just type those in the chat box. We'll try to answer them either during the presentation or before we sign off this evening. And joining us from the National Aviation Education Center is Nathan Huegen. Nathan, glad to have you back on the show.
Thanks, Steve. Always great to be here.
Well, let's talk about the Doolittle Raid. Of course, we've talked about the Doolittle Raid in great detail, the raid itself and what happened to the raiders afterwards. But there's really a legacy that happened in China that many of us know about, but it's kind of a hidden chapter in history.
Yeah, one of the things that interests me about the Doolittle Raid is I think it might be the biggest little story of World War II. It's this dramatic story. B-25s off an aircraft carrier. I think a lot of people have seen that footage of Doolittle's plane taking off. It goes up and then it dips, and you can just imagine that hesitation. And in some places in big books about the Pacific War, you might see 3 to 4 paragraphs about it. B-25s bomb Japan, they go on and crash in China, and morale, and they get medals, and it was viewed as this big sort of event. And then you could also write entire books about everything from the training to the modifications of the B-25 and everything like that. But one of the most challenging assignments I've ever had in my career was to explore China and find out what they feel about this and how they interpret it in light of what happens after this raid. And so that's what I'll focus a large portion of this on. I'll do kind of the one paragraph about the raid section with kind of this eye toward how is China playing into all of this.
And you were in China in 2019, correct?
In November of 2019, yeah. So one of the interesting things I got to do, and a lot of the work that I was doing was inspired by 2 individuals, James Scott, the author of Target Tokyo, and a contact that he helped set up for me, a woman named Melinda Liu, who is Chinese American, and at the time was the Beijing bureau chief for Newsweek. Her father was one of the English-speaking Chinese men who helped the Doolittle Raiders, was speaking English to them. He was a university student from Eastern China that had been overrun by the Japanese and had fled to the interior, and suddenly found himself interpreting and translating for the Doolittle Raiders. When he immigrates to China, he becomes an honorary member of the Doolittle Raiders and attends as many of the reunions as he was able to attend. And Melinda grew up to become a war correspondent reporting from the Middle East and then getting that assignment in China. And on my trip over there, we traveled a lot together, and it was her research and her connections with the children of the Doolittle Raiders that led to me having access to a lot of the sites where the aircraft had crashed and getting to speak to a lot of very interesting and knowledgeable Chinese historians about what had happened there.
Yeah.
And so we're going to start with a quote that I find from Admiral King is sort of a philosophy that he had, and where the Doolittle Raid really fits into this, that the winner will hit and keep on hitting, even though you have to take stiff blows in order to be able to keep on hitting. And I think that encompasses both what American planners were going to know about the Doolittle Raid at the outset, that this was going to be a very dangerous, hazardous mission, doing things that had never been accomplished before, and what this was going to mean for China. We knew from the outset that landing these planes in China was going to invite Japanese retribution. And of course, the Chinese had been suffering dramatically since 1931 and really since 1937 with this Japanese onslaught and all of its extra effects such as famine, hunger, starvation, massacres of civilians, this is just going to cause another blow to that country. So we'll kind of look here at early 1942. Roosevelt really wants this raid to go. And here's a situation we're looking at in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor has been attacked. Guam is under Japanese control. The British have lost Hong Kong and Singapore. The Philippines, at the time we're planning the Doolittle Raid, is still there, but it's a very undersupplied American resistance in Bataan and Corregidor. Dutch East Indies are under Japanese control. Australia, since the fall of Singapore in February 42, is now threatened. And crucially, the Soviet Union has a separate non-aggression treaty with Japan. In China, the Chinese army has been moved to the interior. Beijing has fallen. The next capital, Nanking or Nanjing, as it's known now, has fallen. And Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, his nationalist army, has moved to the interior. At this time, the communists are just an outlier for the Japanese. They resist when necessary, but they're largely concentrated to rural pockets at which the Japanese aren't terribly interested in moving into. They're providing just meager support here and there. But Chiang Kai-shek being in Chongqing, that's his primary area. So, and the other section with this, we'll kind of look at this on a map. We'll circle Chongqing here just so that people can see it. So there's Chongqing kind of in the center. The Japanese occupied areas of China are off to the coast. And where we're going to focus with the Doolittle Raid is a pocket north of Hong Kong up toward Nanking. That pocket is going to be the area that the plan for this raid is going to look at as our landing fields. There are airfields in this section of China that can be made suitable to refuel the B-25s, to then move them into the interior at Chongqing, and then promise Chiang Kai-shek as a thank you for your support for this, promise him those B-25s will now be in support of China, flown by Americans, but will now have access to supporting and defending China from future Japanese attacks. So let's look now at the constraints and where China is going to fall into this. So we now know, due to the Soviet Union's non-aggression pact with Japan, we can't take off from there. It's not going to be feasible. There are not enough available aircraft in China to support a mission that Roosevelt envisions. Japanese patrols are going to range roughly 300 miles into the seas, so we've got to look how far out, if we're going to do this by carrier, how far out can we launch these planes? That's going to then limit what we can do aircraft-wise. Really, only the B-25, it can take off short, and its wingspan is not going to threaten the superstructure of a carrier. So the B-25 is going to be what's suitable. It's going to need some modifications. Japanese weather patterns are going to come into play as to when we do this attack. And after April, it's not really suitable to run a bombing mission from a carrier over Japan. The weather patterns aren't just going to allow it. And as Hap Arnold is saying at this time, every commanding officer everywhere needs airplanes. So where are we going to find the airplanes to do really a suicidal type mission? So now we look toward the Hornet. At this point, the Hornet is undergoing some testing. It's been commissioned. It's getting some shakeout cruising around, and they will do a test launch of B-25s off of the Hornet in February. The B-25 looking at the Hornet, again, the wingspan will not threaten. They'll get about 4 feet worth of clearance from the wing to the superstructure on the Hornet. So the Hornet will finish its shakeout cruising. It'll do this test launch, and then it will arrive in California, March 1942. It'll meet the B-25s that have been modified for this mission over there, and they'll be loaded up. So we'll look at what have they done to the B-25s. They have increased the amount of fuel. Typically, a B-25 would have 646, give or take, gallons of fuel. Modified version, by stripping a lot of stuff out of the aircraft, they'll have up to 1,141 gallons of fuel. They'll pull out a lot of the radio equipment because we're going to fly these things in radio silence anyway. They'll need de-icers, and they want to document this mission, so they're going to have cameras put all over. And we're expecting that there's a really high chance that several, if not all, of these bombers are going to fall into the hands of Japan. So the Norden bomb sites will be removed, replaced with, very famously, you'll find this in newsreels from the time, a 20-cent device that was devised to be connected to some of the dials that the pilots would see so they could maintain the silence. A Mark Twain bomb sight that's just made out of a bunch of trinket parts that will be the bomb site that will lead them onto their missions. So now let's look at the crews that are going to do this. Originally, we don't know how many B-25s we can get ready. It'll come down eventually to 15, then 16 total aircraft, running 5 crew per aircraft. That's going to give us 80 men total, all of whom volunteer for this mission. And we'll undergo this training to see how short can they take off on a very short runway. And then it will then equate to a very short, for a B-25, carrier deck on the Hornet. So we'll have our 80 men who will eventually take off in these aircraft. And we'll look now at the mission. The mission, these carrier force with some other planes for support in case the carrier fleet is noticed. They will then head from Pearl Harbor, almost mimicking in an opposite pattern the fleet that left Japan, taking a northerly route to attack Pearl Harbor. We'll do that in an opposite direction. The fleet gets discovered, meaning the raid's going to have to take off early. They'll take off in the dawn hours, which is going to put them over Tokyo round about midday. The bombers will get there. They'll hit targets of opportunity, and they're instructed, again, they're going to leave many, many hours early, many hundreds of miles more to fly. They're going to look for an airfield, they were told, in a place called Chuzhou, or as it's pronounced and spelled now, Chuzhou, Q-U-Z-H-O-U. One of the interesting, really fun things about researching anything in China is, many people would know, China has 2 systems, or we have 2 systems of transliterating Chinese characters into English language or Roman alphabet, Wade Giles and Pinyin. And then there's the Chinese preferred method that'll come later. So just researching place names gets really tricky. You'll also see references to a Chuxian, which is still there as a Chuxian, spelled with a Q in the front, as a district of the city of Chuzhou. So that's where they're going to go. And in the film Midway, which had some Chinese financing to it, you'll find Doolittle asking for Chuchao and how to get to Chuchao from the Chinese civilians on the ground. After the mission, the planes go in, they're bombing in Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka. They actually pull back out to the east and traverse the Japanese home islands, moving to the southwest, and that's going to be their route into China. One of the planes does not have enough fuel to make it. There were some modifications done without Doolittle's knowledge to one of the B-25s. It won't have the fuel to make it. They decide while in the air, they're just going to go to Vladivostok, Russia. They were told specifically not to do it. They went anyway. It's going to put Soviets into a weird situation. The Soviets will eventually imprison that crew, but then smuggle them to a prison near the British-held Iranian border, and some British SOE operatives will run in and get them out. But they were told specifically not to do that, but they did it anyway. So there's our mission. Now let's look at where we're going and into China. And I found this quote from an aide to Stilwell, General Stilwell, being the commander of American forces and the principal American military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. One of his aides gave this really interesting quote. It's a place rather than a nation. It's fractured. You're making deals with Chiang Kai-shek, but Chiang Kai-shek's generals have to make deals with warlords. And in many cases, they are provincial warlords themselves. So that goes into this place rather than a nation, an economy wrecked. And then we'll look at tens of millions at this point have died from bullet disease or starvation. And some of that is a self-inflicted. One of the biggest humanitarian disasters of the war was a decision made by Chiang Kai-shek himself. So let's look at some of the details we'll see from China on this next slide. About 500 million, give or take, on their population records pretty meager at that time. China's been kind of carved up by colonial powers. Japan has been sitting in Manchuria that they renamed Manchukuo since 1931. It's a very rural population. 80% is rural. Your coastal ports, your eastern cities are controlled by Japan. Previously, especially in places like Shanghai, Western powers like the French, the Germans, the Dutch, the Americans had carved out their own little concession zones. Those had all been overrun by the Japanese by this point. And this 1938 Yellow River flood, a massive humanitarian crisis that gets very little reporting in the histories of World War II. As Chiang Kai-shek's forces are fleeing from Nanking, they're heading toward the city of Wuhan, which a lot of us learned about in 2020. On their way to Chongqing, Chiang Kai-shek is faced with an awful decision. The Japanese have the ability to catch up with his forces and possibly outflank him. The decision they have, and it's been done previously in Chinese history, is to destroy the flood protection along the Yellow River. What this is going to do is unleash these waters onto a lot of subsistence villages and towns along the river. It's going to flood that land. It's also going to cause that land to become unfertile. And this is kind of a breadbasket of China here. When that land becomes unfertile, it's going to unleash a massive famine that lasts beyond the end of World War II. And it's 500,000 or so are going to be attributed, deaths are going to be attributed to this decision by Chiang Kai-shek to stop the Japanese advance behind him with this flooding of the Yellow River. So we'll look at this next map. It'll give you a little bit of a sense of where this is happening. So go pull back now to our map. Again, we'll circle Chongqing. We'll look at the area we're interested in is the landing of the Doolittle Raiders. And just to the north, I've got a little box on this map. This is the area that will be impacted by the Yellow River flood. And now we'll zoom in with a map that's been done of the area. So on that first map, you see kind of this distance we're talking about. So from where he destroys the flood protection, and he'll do this along the Yellow River, you can see the large swath of land in some of the towns, villages, and cities that are within the path of this floodwater. And again, estimates at 500,000 will perish as a result of this decision by 1946. And so we're looking at everywhere you look in China, massive humanitarian crisis, even if the Japanese haven't touched it directly. So let's look now at the Doolittle Raid's descent. So the raid goes off. The 16 bombers all do reach Japan. They bomb targets of opportunity. If they can't find their primary target, which many of those 16 aircraft could not, they'll bomb something that looks like a military target. To set an example, we wanted only to bomb military targets. Doolittle was adamant that we don't threaten the Imperial Palace, that we don't bomb schools or hospitals or anything like that. Military targets. They find their targets of opportunity, pull out to the east, except for the plane to the Soviet Union. They'll continue west and then to the north. Pull out to the east, make your way as close as you can get to China, plan to ditch your aircraft. This is a sculpture that I found in a museum in Zhejiang province, the coastal province, in that bubble that's not occupied by Japan at this point. And you'll find a lot of sculptures like this, very proud, duty-bound Chinese civilians helping the airmen who are obviously exhausted and wounded in this. So we'll go on to the next image and we'll hear from Dick Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot. We'll hear from him himself and his story of what his landing in China was like.
The Chinese heard the aircraft engine and they thought it was Japanese and they cut off all electricity. And as it was, we had to fly until we ran out of gas and bailed out. In my case, my chute drifted over a pine tree and I had a real soft landing. The next day, after spending a night in the tree, the next day, I made a hammock affair and tried to go to sleep, but I was too scared. I might have dozed off a little bit, but I don't remember getting much sleep. In the morning, I found myself about 12 feet off the ground. So I climbed down and started walking. I had a compass and started walking west. I chose to stay in the hills because I figured that my chances of not getting captured were better than following some line of communications, which they had told us on the carrier that all of China was not occupied. They went up the lines of communications. I walked all day and arrived over on a cliff. And down below, I saw a little military cantonment that had a Chinese nationalist flag. So I walked down there and was accosted by a Chinese guerrilla soldier. He took me to a building that had nothing in it but a table and a piece of paper with a sketch of a twin-tailed airplane with five parachutes coming out of it. So through hieroglyphics and so forth and hand deal, I got him to take me where he had taken the individual that drew the picture. It turned out that that was Colonel Doolittle.
So as Dick Cole's mentioning there, he's greeted by these Chinese military officers. He's in the footsteps of his commanding pilot, Doolittle. It will take them about 10 days to reach the cave where the rest of the Doolittle Raiders are kind of on a rendezvous, and I'll kind of get into some pictures of that later. When they talk about landing in rural China, it's very, very rural. And as Steve mentioned at the outset, when I was there in 2019, I was fortunate in some negotiation with the Bureau of Foreign Affairs to have them escort me to some of the locations that local historians in China had remembered. In fact, an archivist in the city of Jiangshan, which is just south of Chuzhou, had been collecting fragments of the B-25s and other things like oil dipsticks and any sort of metal fragments that were in the area. And he had been keeping these hidden in his archive, along with some nationalist Chinese headstones. And in recent years, it had gained more acceptance for him to display and to talk about these things he had collected. And he had, in talking to civilians, had pinpointed several of the landing sites. So this farmhouse, which is well up in the mountains south of Chuzhou, is the farmhouse where Charles Ozuk, who was a navigator from Crew 3, where his broken leg was treated inside this house by a family that was in there. And I look at this, I mean, the house obviously needs some work. No one lives there at the time. And if I had been doing this battlefield research in Europe or anywhere in North America, they would not have let me climb the stairs to get up and take this photo where I took it. But it was very interesting that there was at least a good pocket of known individuals who knew of these sites, and fragments of the B-25 had been picked up on this mountain. And so they take me up there, and this was my first foray into rural China. And I noticed, I felt like I was in Rocky IV. I had the black car, it was kind of trailing me. These were my Bureau of Foreign Affairs escorts, separate from my interpreter and from Melinda, the journalist who was with me. But we got up there, and I heard stories of children of the Doolittle Raiders who had come just a few years before me and had visited the same farmhouse. And in fact, they had kept a bed in the area, a bed that looked very similar. It's not the exact bed, but a bed very similar to one that Charles Ozuk would have been recovering from his broken leg in this bed before he received some transit down to the mountain. The tea kettle to the right, I don't believe is period authentic. I'm not sure the electricity was quite up this mountain yet. As we drove down, I got to see a lot of houses very similar to this, and I saw farmers walking their herds down the same road that we were driving down, still sort of whipping the herd, keeping them all in formation, usually 4 to 5 animals at a time as we came down. And if I look at a map of modern China and to pinpoint where this photo was taken, you'll see that Shanghai and all your sort of well-known cities off to the east, and then several hundred miles inland. Again, as you see, Zhejiang, Zhejiang, that's the province that we're in. I'm just on the western border of it. Nothing around. There's some highways to the north. If you see the city of Jinhua, Chuzhou is along that highway system up to the north, but this took us by car to get to the top of this mountain about an hour and 45 minutes. So quite a trek, even by modern methods, which is why some of these guys would take days in order to reach a rendezvous point. And interestingly, I know a lot of people are familiar with Ted Lawson's story. I was also able separately to go to a bed at the former hospital where Ted Lawson's was treated after his leg was amputated. So that was another location I was able to visit. That was in a more urban type environment. He was brought there specifically for that treatment. So this is an image. When I started out, I had a picture of sculptures of the Doolittle Raid out in front of a museum in Chuzhou dedicated to the Chinese assistance to the Doolittle Raiders. And it's this image that sculpture was based off of. And this is what you can see even when they would get to a town or a village, this is the kind of environment that they would go through. When I was touring around, my Bureau of Foreign Affairs escorts had explained to me that they don't usually see a lot of foreigners in these villages. And it wasn't a huge trade in revisiting the wreckage of the Doolittle Raider site. Of course, China was closed to us for several decades, and travel outside of the major cities was very limited. So I kind of felt the same as people walking down the street here, that a lot of people were coming out wondering what I was there for. They thought I was going to swing some big land deal or was negotiating to build a factory or something nearby. But the foreign affairs people introduced me to some of the elderly citizens in the town who remembered seeing a sedan chair or a Chinese carrying device with Americans on it when they were children, or hearing the stories of the Americans who had passed through their town many, many years ago. So through interpreters, they told me many stories of what that was like. Now, get to kind of the crown jewel of what I was looking for in this area, and that is the rendezvous point at a cave outside of Air Station 13 in Chuzhou, or spelled Chuchao at that time. And this image is what I was hoping to find the location of. Strangely enough, it's inside a gated community. So we pulled up in my little caravan that was traveling with me, and we roll into, they first take me to the headquarters house that's located here, and then drive me to the cave. And I'm holding up this archival image, and here it is. There's the scar over top of the cave, the little cut in the rock right there. It's been fortified with some brick on the side from what it was before. So the raiders, upon landing, are brought to this site. They go to the air station first, and then are brought to this cave because it's feared that the Japanese reprisals could come in the form of bombardments. So the raiders are kept in this cave, which, if you pull up on a map, is located just to the southwest of Chuzhou, where I have that little mark. You'll see Chuzhou on the map. You'll see the little mark that Steve is circling there, just to the southwest of Chuzhou. And they'll hang out there for several days. And, the Americans, as they're getting a little more comfortable, start taking photos. They'll pick up some of the Chinese implements, whether it's parasols, umbrellas, starting to kind of make themselves at home here in this district of China, smiles all on their faces that this is really going to belie what's in store for this region next. But they'll also do the great traveler thing, is mark their territory and where they were. And if I had any doubts that anybody was going to steer me wrong and not take me to the site where this happened, I find Fitzhugh and Radney's names carved directly in the stone, just to the right of the cave entrance. And at this point, I was about 10 days in China. I had about 3 English-speaking people in this rural part that I was really getting to know quite well over a lot of rice wine and Chinese beer. But getting to see this and actually put my fingers into the inscription here was really something. And one of the experts, I really have to thank him, was Wang Zheyong, and you'll see him here pointing out this cave, which images of it are in a museum that he helps advise to, and he's showing me some of the other images that are in this area, including an administration building, which is on the top right of this display, and several of the other caves here. They also told me that some of the weapons that might have been used to attack us, if we ever meddled around in Chinese affairs in the 50s and 60s, were being stored in these caves at that period of time. So it's a little fun thing to note, or less than fun. And I also met Huegen, who was an archivist in Zhongshan. I'd mentioned that he's the one who really assisted with some of the artifacts and memories and really adding that level of here's proof that these things happened here and that we have been studying and holding and keeping these things. And there is a fragment of one of the B-25s that he's holding for me in a tray on the left, and on the right is a measurement stick that has been modified with Chinese measuring symbols on it that was being used by the villagers that had found the wreckage of the plane and had just sort of used whatever they could in a really deprived state for it. Now, as most people know, the 80 raiders, there were some casualties of the raid. It's 3 who didn't make it after impact and 8 who were imprisoned. And when I made it to Shanghai, this is the Kempitai headquarters with the prison cells included in it. So as you look here, this is where the 8 raiders who were captured eventually ended up in really inhumane conditions. There is nothing interpretive at this building. In fact, sections of it are apartments or their own, sort of like a condo situation. And parts of it are a shipping center. And in the case of my visit, these were men's button-down dress shirts, very similar to what I'm wearing now. It's very made in China. It's probably in a facility kind of like this. It was very puzzling as to why I was there, but I was adamant this was the Kempitai headquarters. These were the prisons, and where these shirts are were prison cells. There couldn't really get records on who was held in what cell, but we did know these were prison cells, very heavy doors that are still on there, and it was eerie to step in there and sort of dodge the piles of wrapped up dress shirts as I walked through, but it was an eerie feeling to be in there. Now, inside has been modified. It's more spacious than the prison cells would have been at that time. So 3 of the Doolittle Raiders will be executed. They'll be brought out to a cemetery outside of Shanghai and shot. The other 5 will be granted mercy, but 1 will die of mistreatment with the prison, the malnourishment. 4 will survive to liberation at the end of the war. Now we'll shift to the Japanese response. So the attack on Japan's home islands, 1 was an insult to Japan's army, and is also going to play into an early stage planning operation that Japan had for this section of China, because there was a fear that Americans could use airfields in the east of China, in the section where Doolittle Raiders crashed and rendezvoused, that they could use them to threaten Japan. So there was, on paper, a plan to invade and occupy these airfields. It will then be accelerated in kind of a haphazard way and launched on May 15th, 1942. A force of about 180,000 strong Japanese soldiers will head from areas to the northeast, Hongqiao, and you see Shanghai on the northern right of this map, and it'll also come down from the north with a principal target of Nanchang, a larger city where there were also civilians who would help the Doolittle Raiders. Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang forces, the Nationalist Army, will respond with 300,000 strong but very outgunned, fractured-style troops who will just hold a few lines here and there. The Japanese will overrun the airfields and take the military sites, but will abruptly pull back of what they consider to be useless territory, anything that's not going to be important or not worth holding. They'll abruptly pull back from that in a designed, planned strategy in July of 1942. But what comes next will be worse than what an occupation, a direct occupation, could have looked like. A few things I was able to see. This is Huegen, the archivist again, took me to a site to the southwest of Chuzhou where the trench lines from the Chinese stand to prevent a complete encirclement of Chuzhou took place. He went out with his metal detector. He still finds pieces of battle remnants out on these fields, and we were uncovering leaves, and he was showing me several things out there. Again, the marker that I have on the map on the left shows where we are. on this. And then I did find a Chinese battle map that will pinpoint this area, and Steve will do his best to kind of follow where I want to circle. But there is an 86 on this map that he'll bring his cursor to. It's kind of in the center of this map. That area is Chuzhou, and you'll see a lot of blue arrows. Blue arrows are the Japanese forces here, and red arrows are Chinese movements. Thin red lines and arrows are Chinese retreats. And in the case of where I was looking at these trench lines, there's a very tiny red line to the southwest of Chuzhou. That is where I was on those trench lines, and it was kind of the stand, and combined with that Chinese retreat in the center is what's preventing an entire encircling of Chuzhou. So 300,000 Chinese strong, 180,000 Japanese forces. The hardest thing with working with maps that don't even have any Roman alphabet characters on them is that you can't really even get the scale of the distance. So focusing on the estuary, of which Shanghai is just north of, to Nanchang, or to the south tip of this lake, we're looking at a battle line of 270, give or take, miles long. And so this assault is a dramatic months-long battle that is part of what the Japanese call Operation Seigo, and what is commonly referred to as the Zhejiang, the province to the right, coastal province, Jiangxi, province to the left, campaign. So two provinces in China that face this Japanese onslaught. So we'll go into that pullback that I mentioned. It starts in July of 1942. The reason for that pullback is the retribution aspect of the campaign. The military targets have been taken, they'll be held, the airfields will not be a threat to the Japanese home islands. But now what comes in is Unit 731, chemical, biological warfare. So in a strange coincidence of history, Nanjing, or Nanking, which is infamously the rape of Nanking that many have read books about, the Japanese will order anthrax, cholera, several other easily contagious diseases, other bacterial infections, to be delivered in large quantities to Nanjing, where they'll then transfer them into bottles, drinking size bottles, that will then be tossed into wells. And the monument that you're seeing on your screen with the Chinese text on it is a plugged well in which the Japanese, in their retreat, had thrown the bottles that would be intended to spread disease among the Chinese, who then would reoccupy these cities. And on the back wall, you'll find some of the names. They couldn't get a full listing of them, but names of those who were known to have died as a result of the biological warfare that was then inflicted on the Japanese. The numbers that we see out of this are awful. The Japanese casualties numbers are really, really difficult to document. You have Chinese numbers versus Japanese numbers. Overall casualties for the Japanese, about 40,000. A much larger share of wounded that would be, and infected. The diseases, for any Japanese who are still in the area, they still spread to Japanese. There's no reason they wouldn't if they're still in these areas. You're not going to see the same death as a percentage of casualties as you will when they're fighting the Americans on the island campaign. It's very common to see 93 to 97% of Japanese casualties or deaths when they're fighting Americans on the islands. That same aspect of stand your ground, don't surrender is not applicable here. So the casualties are not going to equal that large of a number of deaths. We're more looking at about 10,000 or so on the Japanese deaths. Chinese casualties military, about 50,000. Roughly 10 to 12,000 killed out of the force that they send in of 300,000. They're not really effective. They'll end up moving back toward the primary defense of Chongqing, which is of the utmost importance. That's where the American military liaisons, the American heads of the American forces, and Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang heads are located. Chinese civilian death toll in numbers that are relatively accepted on an international community. You'll find this in British records, as well as in Japanese estimates, and the brief amount of post-war estimates that we in the United States are able to gather at around 250,000. Those airfields are lost. We'll not have access to those eastern Chinese airfields, but Chongqing is still secure. And Chiang Kai-shek will look at this in an interesting way. Of course, his wife, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, will give medals to the Doolittle Raiders. He will honor them very publicly. while not being pleased with the consequences that will come in for China on this. But the long-term legacy, the aspect that I was able to gain access to these sites that people remembered and had known about and studied, even when it was not officially allowed for them to study or honor the American military contributions of World War II, they still could decades later. So this picture, the archival image on the left of the screen, I found this in no fewer than a half dozen museums dedicated to World War II in China, of a Chinese merchant or a ship dock worker lighting the cigarette of an American. And propaganda then, still propaganda today. I actually was very intrigued to find that a lot of attention was paid to Chiang Kai-shek's forces in museums in modern China, and often would be the parts that weren't translated that I had people sort of describe to me later were that these forces were Chinese. They saved China because they are Chinese. And of course, those are the forces that would flee to Taiwan during China's civil war. So there's a bit of a little extra message that's presented within all of the propaganda that's still there. I think, though, the biggest tribute that you can see, a lot of people are familiar with China's terracotta warriors from Qin Shi Huangdi, the China's first emperor, is that in western Yunnan province, which is very close to the border with Myanmar, formerly Burma, that there is an American section of terracotta World War II warriors. So this is not related to the terracotta warriors that people see on tourist sites that are over in the old imperial China. This is separate. There is a gigantic World War II terracotta warrior park near Burma that has everything from old Chinese soldiers, young Chinese soldiers, Chinese aviators, Chinese ground forces, different Chinese battalions, all in their own sections. But seeing that there's an American section and bust of Joseph Stilwell throughout this place was very intriguing. And it is next to China's largest remaining nationalist cemetery from World War II, at which I watched busloads of Chinese citizens from all over the country get out and pay their respect to those killed in World War II wearing a nationalist Chinese uniform. Whereas my archivist friend that I met in Jiangshan had told me he had to save the nationalist tombstones in Zhejiang province from massive construction in the 1970s. He had to go out himself, save and hide those. Now he's praised for it, would not have been at the time. But knowing that this cemetery was still there and watching the Chinese come out and lay flowers at the names that were printed and visiting the headstones that were around the cemetery was really quite interesting. And of course, I do have to end with another image that I saw throughout China. Here is Mao Zedong with an American. This American was aided by Chinese communist soldiers and then was brought to have an audience with Mao himself. I'd often find this near the end of any museum that I visited, something to do with Americans in the presence of Mao in World War II, whether it was a rescue attempt or whether it was there for a meeting or something. There was still a little way of placing the communist efforts in a little bigger impact than what they were really doing at that time. So it was quite a journey, but one that I'm still, I think a lot of Western researchers are just scratching the surface of what this Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign was and the retributions that came about to the Chinese population for their assistance to the Doolittle Raiders, and adding that insult of the first time Japan's home islands will be attacked during World War II. So, thanks, Steve.
Oh, yeah.
Masterful slide transitions.
We've got questions from the audience, but I'm going to start with one of mine. And this is, and again, if you study World War II at all, you kind of get a little taste of what happened, the Japanese with the retribution. But is the reason that it's not as well known is probably because of the Civil War and the upheaval in China, and then China, isolating itself pretty much from the world?
Yeah, I mean, if you can't get there to research, I mean, memory goes pretty quickly. Right. And if you can't get there to research, then the story's not really going to be told. You add to that the confusion over place names, how difficult it is even for me to explain a battle map and the extra steps and unfortunately, I don't know what I would have done if I didn't have like Google Translate on my phone to take pictures of images and then go back to the etymology of where is this and trying to decipher all of these other things. But yeah, the Korean War, the end of the Chinese Civil War, into the Korean War, to that feud with China, Nixon's eventual reopening, nobody's really focusing on, of course, you hear a lot, China is the forgotten ally. Nobody really focusing on the details of the story. We still get the byline of, and the Chinese paid a terrible cost for the assistance rendered to Doolittle and his raiders.
So Mark is asking, and we've got a couple of questions that kind of take us back to the raid itself. In your opinion, what was the effect of the raid, especially in the Japanese decisions to attempt the Midway operation?
Yeah, so I mean, you'll find the effect, the impact it has on Japan is very psychological. Material damage, minor, especially if you look at this in light of what we do in 1945. Material damage, minor, but the effect to the Japanese psyche does impact them of dedicating more resources to their home, to the home front, knowing that it's possible. And in light of Midway, they actually redirect some forces to defend from the north. That's kind of precedes their impetus toward the Aleutians. And this plays into the Japanese trying to overrun any place that could have an airfield that could possibly threaten them. And they don't piece together immediately that this carrier attack did it. They're focusing on the airfields. And so getting those airfields in the Aleutians, getting airfields in eastern China, that's where it's going to come into direct consequence. I do think, to an interview I watched with Davy Jones, another of the Doolittle Raiders, and he was asked that same question of, what do you think about the Doolittle Raid and its significance and its legacy? Do you think it was worth it? And he pauses for a little bit, and he makes a statement of, he retires as a general, he'll continue to fly, he'll be captured by the Germans, he's all these other things that he does, and in his career, and he says, and everybody just wants to ask me about the Tokyo Raid. But this is in the same interview that he has just spent 58 minutes talking about the Tokyo Raid to then spend 2 minutes saying, everybody only asked me about the Tokyo Raid. Again, it's that biggest little story from the war that has these far-reaching kind of tentacles that do impact this Japanese psychology, and militarily, of course, in China as well.
Yeah, and echoing that quote, before he passed away, I had opportunity to interview Dick Cole a couple of times, and we talked about the Doolittle Raid, but then in the time after the interview, when the cameras are off and everything, he really told me that he was very proud of what he did on the Doolittle Raid, and we heard his audio, but he said for the most part he just sat there and let Jimmy Doolittle fly the airplane because that was the boss, and he didn't want to screw up. I mean, that was a quote from him. He said, I just didn't want to screw anything up. But he went on to talk about his post Doolittle Raid activities, flying missions over the hump, and how much pride he had in those missions. And so even though he was so well known for the Doolittle Raid, he had equal pride for what he was able to accomplish post raid.
It was Davy Jones the first time. He was the first Doolittle Raider I heard an oral history from. This I'm talking probably 15 years ago now. And it was when he mentions when Doolittle arrives at that cave outside of Chuzhou, and the way he says it, he goes, and then 10 days later, there's the old man. And but this sort of reverence, and it's like, I think of Dick Cole sitting next to me. I don't want to screw up for Doolittle, but it was this whole, his presence was that commanding of a thing for these guys.
It certainly was. Henry's wondering if the Martin B-26 was ever considered for the mission. I believe it was.
It was. It comes down.
Do you remember why it was ruled out?
I think it was the wingspan issue. I think they couldn't guarantee clearance from the superstructure on a carrier. And I think that was the determining factor. I don't know if it was a short takeoff or if it was the wing clearance, but it would have been one of those two.
Yep. Yeah, I seem to recall that it had a larger wingspan that really, there was no margin for error. Not that there was much margin for error on the B-25 either.
No, they said 4 feet, and they had one wingtip off the carrier and 4 feet of clearance from the island.
Something I read not too long ago, that there were 16 airplanes that were on the aircraft carrier, on the Hornet, but the original plan was only to fly 15 and have one as a spare. And then and I think that the 16th that was added was supposed to fly back with a report. Like they were going to take it and then it was going to leave and fly. And Doolittle said no. And then it ends up it being added on to the roster of those that will attack Tokyo. And there's a lot of, in the whole planning of this, how do they do it? What do they hit? Do they go in groups? Do they all go at once? What time do they get there? And you read so much about the planning and then it's, oh no, the fleet's discovered. We got to go now, and we're heading out. It's 10 hours early, but we're going. And do we have enough fuel? We'll figure that out later. Of course, that leads to the next question. Henry was asking, how historically accurate was the Hollywood film 30 Seconds Over Tokyo?
You know, it's been so long since I've seen it. I've just seen fictionalized account. Ted Law. It's based off of Ted Lawson's accounts. That he writes down pretty quick after the war. It's been so long since I've seen it that I don't really have enough to answer it right now. I don't know if you have any more on it. It's a Hollywood film, number one, and it was right during the war, so it's got a little bit of propaganda to it. I don't want to use that word because it's negative, but it's a very rah-rah kind of thing. Mm-hmm. They get the events right. Whether it's down to the detail, I'm not too sure, but it's a good place to start. Read the books. Yeah. As we say the word propaganda, looking right at this picture of Mao with the American soldier, that sort of graces the end of every museum that I visited. Yeah.
Has the Russian government ever confirmed the existence of the B-25 that landed in the Soviet Union?
They have. There were declassified documents that showed that the Soviet Union did knowingly, in discussions with the Western Allies, bring that crew to a place where they could be, quote, liberated. So yes, they did acknowledge, and it was during that brief period of time after the Soviet Union fell when Western researchers, guys like Antony Beevor, could get in so he could write his book on Stalingrad, that a lot of that declassified information could answer some of those questions that, yes, the Russians did knowingly, purposely put these guys near the Iranian border so the British could come in and get them.
The maps that you were showing, are they in any particular common scale?
The one I was using, the main one, John Parshall, who's a brilliant historian himself, he made a lot of the maps that I use that are nice and colored and clear in the presentations. The Google Maps, when I was showing a modern map, I was using a Google map to give a location for it. The one I used about the attack on Chuzhou came from the news maps that were sent out during World War II. You see, they're very large and were instructed for Americans to follow the war. That's probably more artistic liberty with that because it's going to fit into a production that's determined to be readable. The Chinese map that I showed, to my knowledge, is fairly well to scale. It was hard for me to figure it out. I had to kind of match up features such as an estuary and a lake to kind of match that up so I could give a good look at what the scale was from that. But the Chinese map was to scale of their own map making with the map. It was a post-war production from one of their books.
Good. And you mentioned this earlier, but maybe Steve missed it. It is accurate that the air crews were directed not to bomb the Emperor's palace?
It was, yes. According to Doolittle's records, he did not want to bomb anything that was civilian. He wanted to stick to military targets on this. So it's kind of sort of designed to send a message. Of course, very different than 1945, which is get this war over with. So, they were instructed to not do that. I think there are some films that show, maybe it was even Pearl Harbor, that shows the Emperor being hastened to try to get to safety or something like that. Yeah.
And here we're going, Sean's got us deep into trivia now. How many USS Hornets were commissioned?
So this one was sunk, and there's the one that's the one that's now the museum battleship.
Right.
Steve, how many do you know?
I'm thinking there's only 2.
Yeah, the modern battleship museum had, at least had a section. Of course, it's not the Hornet that's in this attack is at the bottom of the sea, but the current Hornet museum ship has a section dedicated to the Doolittle Raid.
And Tony has one. Chinese civilians continued to assist downed American airmen throughout the war. It wasn't just the Doolittle Raid, but throughout the period. His father had friends assisted back to base during his time in B-25s in the 14th Air Force, 1944 to 45. Nathan, did you get a sense of that in rural Chinese that they had any idea of the raiders' actions at the time?
So if you say in 1944 was some like a rural person in Western China, would they have known what the Doolittle Raid assist? I think that it had spread among the Chinese population, and of course you have Americans around, and it had spread among Chinese military commanders, and at that point they know Americans are friends. It's easy, of course, to tell an American from a Japanese, so they're going to help Americans where necessary. Retribution is going to get trickier for the Japanese as the war goes on. They don't have as many resources. They're now looking toward the island campaign in the West. But one thing that I always do want to point out, this is based on research that Richard Frank had done, the author of Guadalcanal and Downfall, that there were 40 Japanese, or the equivalent of 40 Japanese infantry divisions operating in China. The Americans will encounter the equivalent of 11 during the island hopping campaign. So it was important for us to keep Chiang at least happy and in the war. But there are numerous stories of Chinese civilians assisting downed airmen. Of course, they have the blood chits explaining to get the flyers to the nearest base. To help out where possible. I did get a sense of that. There were many more stories, especially as I got to Western Yunnan province. So when I get past Chongqing and Kunming, I'd see a lot of those stories in some small museums. Of course, there's even in outdoor museum spaces in places like Tongchong. That's actually where that cigarette photograph was taken. I'd find a lot of stories of local civilians who had helped the Americans out there as well. So one of the other interesting ones is I did have some connections with a woman named Nell Calloway, who is a granddaughter of Claire Chenault, who runs the Chenault Aviation Museum in Monroe, Louisiana. And she would get invited to China quite often for every time that they dedicate another statue of her grandfather. And so she traveled quite extensively there and talked a lot about how she has this little museum next to an airport in Monroe. And she'll get a few dozen visitors a day or in a week during really hot season. And then she'll go to China and speak to 10,000 people at a statue dedication. It was an interesting thing for me at that time when I was talking to Mel.
Yeah. Dominic has a great comment that I absolutely have to pass along. He says, "Thank you very much. It is a semester or two of study in an hour."
Thank you for that.
Yeah. And we've just got a couple of minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about your day job as a Vice President of Education at the CAF's National Aviation Education Center. I understand you had a whole hangar full of students in this week.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest joys of my job, I'm shocked I was able to fit this in, but this week we're running a program at the Henry B. Tippie National Aviation Education Center called A is for Aerospace. And we'll see about 950 to 1,000 first graders this week from local school districts around the Dallas area, getting their first sort of spark of excitement for aviation. So they're getting to put their hands on an airplane. We're teaching them about nose art. They're learning ground marshaling, which becomes a game of red light, green light. You see them with their sticks doing this, and then we teach them the X. So the excitement level is off the charts in here, and it's really a privilege. Something that I get to watch and participate in. I mean, it's the most fun we have all year.
There you go. And if folks want to find out more about the National Aviation Education Center and the activities that are going on, what's the website address?
It's FLYNAEC.org. And you'll find our educational program, summer camp coming up. We're also the home now of all 34 pieces of nose art that were famously on display in Midland. All 34 are now on display on our site in a very well-curated, artistic kind of way. So, yeah, lots going on here.
Very good. Nathan, thank you for taking some time out to share your insights with us. We do appreciate it. And thank you for joining us tonight. We'd like to hear your thoughts on tonight's episode, or if you have ideas for future topics, just drop us a line at media@cafhq.org. If you liked what you saw tonight, please share it across your social media platforms. And remember to subscribe on YouTube. Click that bell icon to get notifications when our new episodes are posted. Until next time, I'm Steve Buss, wishing you blue skies and tailwinds. Have a great night.